everybody. Welcome to Square Off.
Liz, a U.S. Court of Appeals has ruled that the NCAA does not need to compensate college athletes, saying that scholarships, well, that's enough. I disagree. The schools make millions of dollars off these kids. Throw them a few bucks.
Yeah, except, Mark, these kids get to go to some of the best schools in the world because of their athletic abilities. A scholarship can be worth tens of thousands of dollars a year, and I think a free ride to an education is a fair trade. We'll debate that later on Square Off.
The province of Ontario has revealed the new requirements necessary to protect vulnerable adults following the inquest into the death of an Ancaster man who drowned at a home where he was being cared for.
38-year-old Guy Mitchell functioned at the level of a 5-year-old, and in 2012, he drowned in a water tank on the Ancaster property where he lived. The inquest into his death came up with 15 recommendations to prevent future tragedies.
Joining us now to discuss this story is Jeff Manishen. He was the legal counsel for Choices. That's the nonprofit agency responsible for Guy's care at the time of his death. Jeff, how many of these 15 recommendations is the province going to adopt?
I think there's at least 3 or 4 in particular that I've identified that are areas that the province could act on quickly. I expect that there may well be others over the months ahead, but you may recall when I was on the show after the inquest, I said I expected that the ministry would act on some of them, and they have. They've prepared policy directives, and they're up for consultation, so they're available on the ministry website until the end of November. But some of the big ones that the ministry has set out by way of policy directives, picking up on recommendations, one of them is a requirement that for host families that are providing residential accommodation for adults with developmental disabilities, they'll be subjected to unannounced visits at least once a year. In addition, the frequency of visits, it had been by the ministry once every 6 months, it's now once every 2 months. There's a lot of additional information that has to be adhered to with respect to providing a safe environment, with respect to matters such as water safety and fire code requirements, building code requirements, matters of that sort. And issues regarding policy and training for host families are also addressed. So we've got a number of features. One other one is a regularly scheduled meeting that the agency will have with the resident, along with a friend, family member, or some other support person for the resident outside of the host family, to get a sense of how things are going and if that individual had any concerns. These are all areas that were the subject of recommendations. They're now part of the policy directives. 15
doesn't sound like a lot. Do they actually go far enough to ensure, to guarantee the safety of these vulnerable people who so often it's, you know, when their parents pass away, they worry about who will look after their kids, and because there isn't anybody looking out for them at that point?
That's true, Liz. And in fact, there were a number of recommendations that urged the government to consider working groups to look after other measures of protection, such as potentially a provincial advocate for adults with developmental disabilities, just as there is for young people, to be able to have their voice heard for areas of concern, and not through an agency and not through the government and not from a host family, somebody independent whose interest is only the protection of the adult. And legislation to provide protection for adults with developmental disabilities, another recommendation that they urged to be considered. Those will take a while. Legislative changes take longer. Another one was a community forum, and that Hamilton should have this, to be able to hear from and get input from people who had concerns about how adults with developmental disabilities are looked after, and that actually took place. That one was another recommendation that was implemented. Susan Claremont hosted it, or chaired it. It was at the Spectator on Monday night. I went to it, packed house, lots of issues raised and lots of concerns identified.
Jeff, when it comes to decision-making, a lot of these adults that are staying in these homes, they function at the level of a child, like Guy Mitchell. How do we know that their best interests are being met for example, their parents or their family? If these people aren't involved in their lives, how do we ensure that the people that are involved in their lives are looking after them?
Well, that is a real issue, Mark, because the conflict you have is this: someone functioning at a lower level such as that is still considered to be a person. And there's really a reluctancy on the part of agencies or the government to say, no, what we're going to do is basically take their decision-making capacity right out of their own hands, substitute decision-making based on a court order. The preferable approach was supported decision-making, that you have people whose task it is to help these vulnerable people make the right decision, but still let them make the decision. And that is a challenge. In Guy Mitchell's case, he wanted to continue to live at the home that he was in. And he is less of a person if you say, well, that doesn't matter, we aren't attending to your interests, this is what we're doing, you don't have a choice. So those are the kinds of issues that agencies and government have to wrestle with.
All right, let's hope that they get on that quickly. I'm going to ask you about another story. An Ontario judge has struck down a 6-month minimum jail term for growing between 6 and 200 marijuana plants for purpose of trafficking. Now, Jeff, this was one of the Conservatives' signature drug laws. Are you surprised by the judge's ruling?
I'm not, but even when that legislation was proposed, Liz, I was saying you want to have a minimum of 6 months for growing 6 to 200 plants, which you're going to say is for the purpose of distribution. You're going to have a minimum jail sentence for that, and higher minimums depending on the greater number of plants. I was concerned at the time that it would constitute a violation of the provisions of Section 12 of the Charter to be free from being subject to cruel and unusual punishment. And that's exactly what this judge found. So I'm not really that surprised. What the judge found was that there are aspects of this law that could punish somebody who might simply make a mistake, who might have a license to produce marijuana, a medical marijuana license, and might grow more than the amount of plants provided for by the license. And then boom, is that person going to be subject to 6 months?
Right.
The judge felt that that would be grossly disproportionate to what would otherwise be a right sentence.
So this ruling, Jeff, came about by way of a constitutional challenge brought on by a man who admitted to working in a grow-op. So how is a minimum jail term for someone who pleads guilty to growing pot for trafficking purposes, how is that against his constitutional rights?
The way that the law was interpreted, Mark, was this: there are two aspects to a challenge to a sentencing law as being cruel and unusual punishment. You may find that the sentence required by law might be grossly disproportionate to what he'd otherwise get in his circumstances. For this individual, frankly, Mark, the judge felt that this fellow would be getting a sentence to be higher than the minimum.
Right.
So it shouldn't really
This is a
apply.
guy with he had three mouths to feed, so that had something to do with it too, right?
He had a prior conviction. There were an awful lot of plants he was involved in. So for him, as a number, the minimum wasn't really as big a factor. But part of the process of a review of legislation also involves looking at what's called a reasonable hypothetical. The judge says, if he's got a challenge, well, can I reasonably foresee a circumstance in which this kind of punishment would be grossly disproportionate? And that's established by law. Supreme Court of Canada has identified that and confirmed that as a test dealing with the firearms laws last year. So this judge was able to foresee a situation where somebody with a license to produce, call it 200 plants, grew 250 plants. And he actually had dealt with a judicial pretrial with that exact situation, a guy charged with production and possession for their purposes, where he grew more than his license authorized. And the judge said there's a real circumstance where a statutory minimum punishment would be excessive. So that's one of the reasons why he ruled the legislation unconstitutional.
Jeff Manishen, legal counsel for Choices. That's the nonprofit agency responsible for Guy Mitchell at the time of his death. And Jeff, of course, a criminal attorney here in town. Thanks, as always, for joining us, Jeff.
My pleasure. Thank you.
When we come back, will VW be able to recover from the emissions rigging scandal?
And with the loonies value dropping, are we about to pay more for everything? We'll get down to business next on Square Off.